section that we're going to deal with next, I've entitled Negotiating Modernity. And I want to explain a little bit about what I mean by that and some of the things that you can expect in the next readings that you're going to have. We're looking at the time period between the two world wars. And so that is roughly from 1918 to 1945. Most of the texts that we're going to read are going to be in the 20s and some in the 30s because they really capture this modernist movement in very, very specific ways. The other aspect of this section that feeds into this time period, but in a different way, will be the Harlem Renaissance. And so I will talk about that in a later video. But I want you to understand sort of the mindset of people that found themselves situated between the two world wars. So think 1920s specifically here. There was a great deal of uncertainty and disillusionment in the culture at the time, in part because of war, politics, and technology, and the interconnectedness of those three things. So to start with war, World War I is often called the Great War, and it was characterized by trench warfare, which was a gruesome battle strategy, as well as the use of technology. This was the first war in which poison gas was used as a weapon. So you have the first biological or chemical weapon used. Machine guns were part of this war in ways that they had never been before. Tanks, and in fact in certain battles you had tanks going up against cavalry. So really, really advanced technology for the time period, and planes. So this type of technology as part of the war movement created millions and millions of deaths. So the Germans lost 3.5 million people. And the Allies, including the United States, because the United States was part of the Allied powers fighting against Germany, the Allies lost 5 million people. So you really have a lot of aftermath of the war that made people really uncomfortable and really uncertain. Also, you had writers thinking and people, sort of the attitude in general, that they felt that this war was just a war of carnage. And there was a lot of protest and a lot of distrust and disillusionment with the process after the Great War. Politics also marked this period. The politics in Europe changed during this time. Lenin toppled the Romanovs, the Tsar family in Russia, to create the USSR. Germany was devastated as a result of World War I, and because of that and their attempts to reclaim their sense of their place in the world, it led to the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist movement, which is ultimately going to lead to the Second World War. And in Italy, Mussolini came to power, and he was the head of what would become the fascist government in Italy that would join forces with the Germans in World War II. Positively, technology was impacting the country and impacting the world with the automobile, cinema, radio networks, mobility, people were being able to move from place to place, and an easy access to information. Not like ours today, but still relative for the time. So there are all these changes taking place. And so what happens is that people begin to start struggling with, where do I fit in to this very different, ever-changing world, where ways that I understood the past don't work anymore, what my future is going to hold, I'm not sure anymore. And so it just led to this type of uncertainty. And what do I do about it? And so one of the things that also occurred as a result of Freud was, for the first time, people began to really examine themselves psychologically. So the motivations of people, why people do what they do and act the way they act, that was just a new dimension to be considered. So the individual started mattering a great deal. And then you see a lot of experimentation. It's a new world. Things are changing rapidly. And people begin to experiment in all types of ways, writers particularly. And that's what we're going to be most concerned with, is what did writers during this time period do to sort of deal with the change and the uncertainty of the time period that was caused by war and politics and technological changes, as well as later the stock market crash and those types of things. And in other words, I think what they did was to propose new ways of looking at the world. The world is a new place. All of these changes have taken place. So how do we need to switch our perspective? So before we talk about the literature and the writers, I want to talk about one important artist during this time, because sometimes visuals help me understand a concept better. So sometimes looking at a particular piece of art out of a time period can help a person understand what's going on in other artistic medium, like literature, for example. So Pablo Picasso, was the leader of what is called Cubism. And Cubism was a theory in art that attempted to reconstruct a world different from traditional paintings, what a viewer would have expected from a traditional painting. And so in this particular Picasso, you can see that as you move from the left to the right, the images become more and more abstract and more fragmented. What Picasso was trying to do in these fragments was to enable a viewer to see an image from every side simultaneously. And so you don't really get a background or a foreground or even a story in a picture that you could understand. But we wanted to look at the geometric qualities of objects, of people, and give a different perspective, a new way of looking at things, of taking things apart in geometric shapes and reassembling them. So if you think about this painting, and we're going to look at, here's another one too. This is actually a portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, and you can make him out in there, right? But hands down here, face up here. But he wanted the viewer to have every side seen simultaneously, every aspect. So you get this fragmentation that is sort of reassembled in a whole. So if you think about it in terms of writing, writers were doing some of the same things. You will see fragments and fragments of things, of pieces, and you'll wonder, how are these things all connected? Well, sometimes it takes some digging and sometimes it takes some work. And that is one of the criticisms of modernism, is that you kind of have to work at it. You have to, it's an intellectual exercise. So some of these things that we read are going to be a little bit challenging. Just want to prepare you for that. But it is definitely a new way of looking at the world and a way of trying to deal with all the changes taking place. And then here you just see another Picasso as well, with the playing on those geometric shapes. So as far as literary modernism is concerned, okay, so let's connect the art with the literature. There's some things that you need to look for and pay attention to that marked this time period and these works we're going to be studying. One was fragmentation. Just like those Cubist paintings, we will find verbal equivalents of Cubism. Okay, fragments, repetition, seemingly disjointed parts smushed together in a sense of creating something new. Definitely an abandonment of traditional forms. So we won't necessarily get a poem that's recognizable as a poem, or a story that has any sort of sense of narrative structure that you might expect, like a beginning or a middle or an end, or a definite plot or conflict. So just very, very different things. They take the forms and they turn them on their heads a little bit. In some of these works, we'll get this sense of alienation, of not being connected, but wanting to be connected, desperately trying to connect to something. And so with that comes this ambivalence for traditional culture. Sometimes it's hard to tell how these writers felt about traditional culture, because that simultaneously they're using lots of it, lots of references to the Bible, lots of references to different traditions, but at the same time, it's that sense that those things aren't working anymore. And so there's a clear desire to anchor on to something. Okay, they're looking for something and some way to make sense of their worlds. You will definitely see a pushing and a straining of language. So repetition, different languages, all combined together, just trying out new things. You'll see a multiplicity of voices, of points of view, sort of like that Cubist painting, trying to see things from multiple perspectives from all sides at one time. Experimentation, and lots of it. And this will be what's some of the stuff that's the most difficult, is just staying with the piece. And so, according to Ezra Pound, who is one of the leaders of this modernist movement, literary work should always do something unique. And his, I guess, famous encouragement to other writers is make it new. And as long as it was new, then that was good. So keep pushing, keep changing to make it new. So you will definitely see a breakaway from established traditions. You will see writers trying to find fresh ways to view humankind's position in the universe. You will see experiment in form. You will see experiment in style. And so all of these writers we're going to engage: Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. So in their works, I want you to look for this modern sensibility, the sense that the world is changing rapidly and drastically. And what do I do about it? how do I process this change? So I think, and I want to encourage you to look not just for those moments in the literature where you can tell that they're straining for something new, but also those moments when you feel like the writers have found it. They have found what they were looking for. They found something to anchor on to. Maybe not what it had been in the past, but they found something and a way to make sense of their worlds.